Hello viewers, Tim Poole here, editor of Gambling Insider. Welcome to the latest episode of The Huddle. I'm here with Eve Whittaker, Market Planning Director at LexisNexis Risk Solutions. Eve, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, it's a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us to your headquarters. We're going to talk about some pretty important topics today that intersect heavily with gambling, obviously, AML and financial crime. To start off with, can you tell us about what's actually at stake when we talk about these issues? Because there's some big issues at play.
Yeah, absolutely. Anti-money laundering and financial crime prevention are hugely important, particularly when we think about the fact that money laundering, although it can often seem like a victimless crime because we're talking about the flow of funds through a financial system, is actually often the thing that is underpinning really, really serious criminal networks. So we're talking about potentially being funding and facilitating activities like human trafficking, modern slavery, wildlife trafficking. There's a whole host of really, really serious criminal activity that is supported and funded by money laundering activity, which is why it's so crucial to be able to prevent it effectively in all the different places that it can occur, and that includes within the gaming and gambling sector. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Like you say, it's interesting to think of a funnel of funds, and all of these things are affected kind of in so many different industries. If we were to look at the kind of the bottom line, the financial side of it as well, how much do operators sort of stand to lose in this area, and how much can it cost in terms of financial crime and how it affects the sector?
It could be really significant. If we think kind of on a global scale, the UN estimates that across all industries, between 2 and 5% of global GDP annually is lost to money laundering and financial crime activity. And that amounts to about $2 trillion every year. So that cost on a global scale is enormous. And when we take that down to the gambling and gaming sector in particular, there's a really significant margin of activity that can come under that scope. So there are vulnerabilities to money laundering activity within that space, and that means that there is a likelihood that a significant proportion of funds of an individual gaming company are flowing through in a money laundering passage. There's also obviously quite a high level of fraudulent activity that can occur, and then there's an actual financial loss that impacts the firm directly. So there are significant costs to actual financial crime activity impacting the sector, but there's also quite a significant risk that firms are exposed to if they don't effectively comply with the relevant regulations. So obviously firms are subject to AML controls. They need to conduct certain activities to make sure that they're compliant. And if they don't, then they will be subject to regulatory scrutiny, and that can result in really serious fines as well. So in addition to the losses from direct business activity, there's also the potential for enforcement action to impose fines. And just to take an example, in 2023 in the UK, one of the largest gambling firms here was fined 19.2 million by the regulator. So it's a massive sum. So that can obviously have a really serious business impact as well, to say nothing of the reputational risk of being involved in that kind of activity.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I was going to, great point about the, a fine, you can pay a fine, the biggest firms can afford a fine, but the reputational damage, you can't really, it's kind of irreversible.
Exactly, it's about consumer trust, and it's about making sure that your customers have a great experience and feel safe when they're using your tools and services.
So you mentioned compliance, and compliance is very much, I don't want to say buzzword, because thinking of it as a buzzword is exactly the wrong approach. It's central, but it's something a lot of gambling companies are talking about and looking into at the moment. Two areas of this: if you're an operator looking to comply with the latest kind of regulations when it comes to AML and combating financial crime, what are you looking out for at the top end of the industry? But also, I guess it's a different ballgame for maybe smaller operators.
Yeah, for sure. So at a high level, in most jurisdictions, there are AML regulations in place that impact the gaming sector, and they require activities like customer due diligence and verification of customers to be carried out. So that'll typically involve ensuring you understand the identity of your customer, ensuring that they meet all appropriate age restrictions and limitations, but then also doing background checks to understand if there's risk exposure. So screening to understand if they're a sanctioned entity and they shouldn't be passing funds. Also screening to understand if there's potentially adverse media or other types of risk like that. That all comes under that bracket of due diligence, which all organisations should really be conducting on any of their customers. And once your customers are onboarded, there's also activities like transaction monitoring, So actually monitoring their behaviour and their activities to understand if there are risky behaviours emerging, and if they are, then there's an obligation to report those to the relevant local authorities for the region that you operate in. So all firms are generally subject to activities like that. I think where the big difference comes in terms of size is how well you're able to implement processes and procedures to tackle those. So for smaller institutions, it might be that processes are maybe more manual and the volume of activity that they have to handle is lower, and therefore they could look at, for example, focusing on having really high quality data to be able to support those processes, whereas at the larger end of the spectrum, automation is likely to be a key issue. So there will be a need to get software in place to start automating some of those processes, because the volume of activity is simply going to be too high to manage on a manual basis. So there are key differences like that. I think the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is as much as size is a relevant factor in the kind of controls that you'll need to put in place, you also need to think about what is the risk that your business is actually exposed to. And that will be very dependent on things like the products and services that you offer. So if you are a casino with a physical presence only, for example, you might be able to actually look at all of your customers in person, understand who they are. You might be operating more with cash-based transactions, and the way you monitor and assess the risk associated with those will be very different from an online gaming company, for example, where you might be dealing with cross-border payments, you might be dealing with quite a high level of anonymity. Your risk exposure there could be really quite significant. So there's a really broad spectrum of risk, and I think the most important thing is to have a really thorough understanding of what are the risks that your organisation is going to be exposed to, so that you can then implement effective controls against them.
Sure. On that kind of topic and note, the gambling industry specifically, looking at this sector, how much work has already been done? How much progress has been made when combating financial crime, complying with everything that you've mentioned in AML, and how much work is there still left to be done?
It's a really good question, because it can often feel like an uphill battle when we're talking about compliance. It's such a dynamic landscape. Criminal activity evolves and becomes more sophisticated all the time, so it can often feel like we're playing a bit of a game of catch-up, trying to work out what's next on the horizon. But I think overall in the gaming sector, there's been a real recognition in recent years of the key risks that we're exposed to in that space, and I think we've seen regulators starting to step up and review that in different areas, which has a really big impact. So there are different regional regulations coming into place to focus on specific risks that are highlighted within the gaming industry. So I think things like the cash-based nature of certain types of gaming, things like the anonymity of online gaming, things like that, are starting to come to the fore as key issues that are associated with the sector. And I think that recognition is a really important first step to being able to actually effectively combat the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. In that situation, would you put more of an onus perhaps on the regulator to get the industry into shape, or I suppose any industry can still self-regulate in the first place and kind of take that challenge on as well?
Yeah, 100%. It's a really interesting balance often to work out, who's ultimately responsible for this. Is it governments? Is it the private sector? There's responsibility in all quarters, I think, to uphold the safety and integrity of our financial systems. Since it's a key part of how we function as a society, it's just necessary. I think one thing that we often see is unless there is a really strong regulatory obligation to input certain procedures, uphold certain practices, it's not always going to be a priority, because there is typically a cost associated with it. And businesses have to make important business decisions, and so where they're choosing to invest will often be dictated by the highest level of business need. So that can mean that there is a need for regulation and enforcement to be there, to be present. I think it's also fair to say that firms do require some guidance on where they should be focusing their attention, and it's not necessarily reasonable to expect every individual institution to understand where the greatest levels of risk exposure are and where they should be prioritising that investment. So I certainly think that regulators and the public sector in general have a really important role to play in influencing that and where that investment should go. But certainly individual firms can also take a responsibility to look at what risk they believe they might be exposed to and to take steps forward to try and address that.
So looking at you guys at LexisNexis Risk Solutions, what do you specifically offer, and how do you kind of partner and work with operators in this area and kind of everything that we've talked about so far?
Absolutely. So we have a range of solutions that we offer to the sector to help address specific problems, and that spans data that we can provide to help perform effective screening and due diligence, and a suite of software solutions. So we can support things like the onboarding and verification process. We can also support companies with performing their due diligence and screening activities, and also when it comes to looking at behavioural monitoring and understanding if fraudulent activity is starting to emerge or if there are behaviours that are looking risky, helping to flag and detect those. And we're utilising a range of quite sophisticated techniques incorporating analysis of a lot of data points to be able to try and surface those risks. So that's been really impactful within the sector so far in terms of being able to help organisations take a much more proactive approach to detecting potential financial crime risk, but also fraudulent activity that's occurring within the space.
You just there, you mentioned a lot of kind of different areas, different aspects to it.
Yeah.
When it comes to large organizations, or I suppose most organizations in the gambling industry these days, they'll have different kind of operational teams. Some looking at fraud, some looking at AML, some looking at the areas we've discussed. How can they sort of, I guess, be encouraged to collaborate more and work together more, I guess, more streamlined, more efficiently, given that there's so many different areas that everyone's sort of covering within compliance?
This is a topic that's very close to my heart because I think collaboration is so important. I think what people often overlook is that right at the heart of being able to effectively detect risky activity, criminal behaviour, is information and data. And there's a wealth of information that resides in each of those different areas that you just mentioned, and it's often quite siloed. So if we think about AML running separately to fraud, running separately to the onboarding process, all of those different departments have insights about the customer. And if you bring those together, you can really start to create a much more comprehensive picture of who that customer is, what their behaviour is, and whether or not it's something that does actually impose a risk to the business. And so to me, it's really important that different parts of the business start to collaborate, potentially look at whether they can consolidate their data and information. I think particularly when we think about AML transaction monitoring versus fraudulent behaviour monitoring, there's so much overlap in the kind of different behaviours that you're going to be looking for there. And similarly in the onboarding space, you're looking at fraudulent profiles, but you're also looking at where there are risks associated with a given individual, and if they are who they say they are, all of those things are part of the same process. And so it's pieces of a puzzle that you really want to be able to pull together. So yeah, in my opinion, it's hugely important, and breaking down those barriers is going to be a big step forward for the industry, I think.
In a previous huddle, one of our guests said that don't just do compliance, do it right. And he kind of emphasized that you can be compliant, but without actually truly, achieving anything. You're just kind of meeting the requirements, but things are slipping through the cracks and the system isn't quite working. When it comes to, I guess my question is how important is that message, in the sense that companies shouldn't just see it as a tick box exercise, because ultimately in the long term, compliance and sustainability are really the only way forward.
Absolutely, yeah. It's such a good sentiment, I think. And you use the phrase tick box exercise, which is unfortunately often what compliance ends up becoming. Like we were discussing earlier, where there's regulatory obligation, that's often where you'll see the greatest level of adherence. But it's super important to go beyond just what do I have to do and think about what is actually going to prevent this activity. And that's where, you want to take it beyond just basic due diligence to actually thinking about taking a risk-based approach to different types of customers, different types of products that you're working with, and really thinking about what the potential exposure each individual part of your business might have is. And it's hugely important to go beyond that. I think quite often compliance can be viewed as a bit of a cost strain for a business. It's an area that you do need to put investment into. Sometimes it's seen as a blocker to business because sometimes it prevents customers from being onboarded. But ultimately, if compliance is done really well, I personally believe it can be a business enabler, and it could even be a competitive differentiator. If you're able to provide a really, really strong level of compliance within your onboarding process, and if you have the right tools in place to make sure that that's a really seamless experience for your customers, then you can deliver something that goes above and beyond what your competitors do, while also knowing that you're fulfilling your moral obligation to prevent some of the really nefarious activities that we talked about right at the start of our conversation.
Yeah. I mean, as you say, we mentioned that right at the beginning. We also talked about how regulators can enable the right kind of environment and atmosphere for this kind of thing. If we were to look at geographically at the moment, and I suppose specifically with gambling, but I suppose there'll be an overlap with overall AML. Which kind of geographically, which jurisdictions are kind of leading the way in terms of regulations, and are there any that are kind of, there's a bit more improvement needed?
There's always room for improvement. I'll say that to start with. Certainly, there are a number of jurisdictions that have very robust AML frameworks in place already. So if you look across the US, the UK, Singapore is doing really well with their kind of data consortia, data sharing approach at the moment. That's a super innovative and super interesting way to approach AML and tackling financial crime. Australia, as well as a region, is generally pretty robust. So there's lots of different regions around the world that have very, very strong compliance programs in place, and most of those extend to the gambling sector. So the UK is really focused at the moment on gambling reform. They're introducing a number of specific legislations right now in that area, so particularly focusing on things like financial vulnerability and looking at limiting the thresholds at which due diligence is required. That's coming into place in the UK at the moment, and similar obligations are coming into place. So we're seeing both Singapore and certain states in Australia starting to reduce their thresholds as well for requiring due diligence and putting limits on the initial bets that customers can play with, things like that. So yeah, there are certainly a lot of regions that are taking it very seriously and that have very robust frameworks in place and that are enforcing them as well, which is just as important. Yeah. In terms of specific regions, I wouldn't want to call out an area that particularly needs to improve, but in general, there are vulnerabilities around the world that still need to be addressed. We've talked a bit about online gambling today already, and the exposure that space has. And because it's incredibly fast moving, it's often cross-border. It also is often a bit more anonymous, or it's easier to create multiple profiles. It is inherently quite high risk, and there are quite a lot of areas of exposure. Now, I think there's a reasonable level of awareness of that, and companies are starting to take moves to tackle it. Regulations are coming in to target it, but there are definitely still gaps that are being exploited by the criminal networks at the moment that are looking to launder funds through the gambling system. And that, to me, is going to be the next frontier that we need to focus on, is really cracking down on the digital risks that we see in that space.
So unfortunately, I'm actually up to my final question, final topic. But I wanted to ask if you could, if the industry and gambling and kind of AML, combating financial crime, if you could achieve one significant development this year in 2025, what would that be?
It's such a big question. It's hard to hone in on just one thing. I think for me, what would be really important and really exciting to see is compliance really being centered within the core of a business and having C-suite level accountability for that goal. And I think once you have that in place, you can start to push forward things like much greater automation of key processes in the compliance space and really start to drive the adoption of innovative solutions to tackle some of the really complex and difficult challenges that we know are existing in the space at the moment. So that's something I'd really like to see moving forward.
Yeah, and that sounds like a very tangible target. And if there's more C-level kind of appreciation and approval of this, then there might be less maybe pushback for compliance departments from above.
So we hope. Absolutely.
Well, Eve, thanks very much for joining me. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.